Breathing in diesel exhaust fumes is like walking into a fire without a mask. Over time, those toxins lead to cancer. Protect yourself with MagneGrip, the easiest, most reliable exhaust removal system that features a true 100% seal to eliminate diesel exhaust fumes. To get free grant assistance, visit MagneGrip.com.
Taking it to the streets is all about advancing firefighter safety and operational integrity for the fire service through provocative insights and dynamic discussions dedicated to both the art and science of firefighting and the traditions of the fire service. The focus at Taking It to the Street continues to be straightforward, street-level talk with intelligent, stimulating, and provocative insights and dynamic discussion with interactive dialogue and, most importantly, listener participation. Just like around the kitchen table or in the day room over a cup of coffee at 02:30 after a good run. And now, the latest edition of Taking It to the Streets with your host, Christopher Naum.
Welcome to this edition of Buildings on Fire's Taking It to the Streets. I'm your host, Chris Naum. Joining me tonight again on our continuing series of the Commercial Fireground, where we are wrapping up our six-part series talking about the Commercial Fireground, is my good friend and colleague, Chief Doug Cline, coming to us from his program of fire and training. We've had the opportunity over the last 6 episodes, and this being our 6th, to sort of cross-pollinate our 2 programs and bring to you, our listeners, a much greater in-depth perspective of today's demands associated with the Commercial Fireground. So, Doug, nice to have you back again, brother.
It's always an honor and a privilege to be back, Chris. I think what we're doing and what we're providing the listeners in cross-pollinating the 2 shows together is just phenomenal. It doesn't get any better than that, and it allows us to be able to share a lot more.
Yeah. Well, very much so. So if this is the first time you're listening into our program or listening to this episode, so on Buildings on Fire, we are continuing our conversation on the built environment, the associations of building instruction and its relationship to a variety of different operational perspectives. We've had the opportunity over the last 5 other episodes in both of our series on both our podcast and our webcast programs on Chief Cline's Fire and Training, and here on Buildings on Fire, we've been talking about the challenges around the uniqueness of commercial buildings. We've talked about everything from the small standalone fast food commercial structure all the way up to the big box or mega centers that exist throughout the United States. The one thing that all of them share is that they all have significant levels of risk. Those risks are clearly associated with the types of occupancies that those buildings have, the types of services provided by their either sales and or commodities that are within the buildings, and then certainly the types of both occupancy loads that are present by both civilians as well as those that work within the buildings, and then also the degree of fire loading that are going to be present, that are also going to be sometimes dictated by seasonal applications, whether we are in a particular holiday period and so forth, and things that are stored, things that are going out the door and such, or things that are in preparation for the kinds of activities that store may have. And then also to the extent of location, Doug, right? Depending upon whether we're on the coast or whether we're inland or in some other location, those particular commercial buildings may have significant fire loading based upon what they're selling to the locals and to the tourists that are coming through there. And certainly in the Grand Strand and in Horry County there, you guys certainly are not of anything less than that, right? Significant fire risks, significant size of buildings, everything from the boardwalk all the way up to the to both boardwalks, I should say, right? From the boardwalk at the beach to the boardwalk at the shopping centers, correct?
That's correct. And, not to mention, across the United States and some of the challenges that go along with what occurs. And one of the things that you think about the ski resorts this time of year and how busy they are, the types of commodities and products that they have in, and the stores, just it's endless of what we could talk about in each district and some of the challenges. And each one of those, Chris, as we talk about tonight, each one of those types of districts has lessons learned that we need to keep in our minds going forward.
Yeah, there's certainly no question about that. I think that lessons and learnings from the Fireground, when we talk about historical precedences, those kinds of situations where in past conditions we've had fires, we've had events, we've had line of duty deaths, and those again continue to challenge us when we talk about what it is that we are learning. We're sometimes forgetting, unfortunately, in that process. We go back to a few things back in the 90s and the early 2000s. I think that when we talk about the Commercial Fireground in particular, there were a series of events, especially when we relate them back to the Commercial Fireground, that set into motion a number of things that we are continuing to discuss and talk about here today that are just as relevant today as they were back in that day. And unfortunately, many of those events sometimes are just lost to history. When we talk about fires in McDonald's, we talk about fires in gift stores, they all have very significant lessons and learnings that set us up into where we are today.
Well, that's definitely true. And, I think about a number of the fires that I have run and how I can relate those to other incidents across the United States that, had different outcomes. And, when we talk about commercial structures, and that's what we're talking about, there's such a vast array of those. And some of the lessons that always seem to come to my mind, anytime the tones drop, anytime the crews are responding, anytime that, I'm listening as the duty chief, I begin thinking about, and it just automatically comes to my mind, what has happened, whether it's been in my career, whether it's what I've learned vicariously by reading NOSH reports or by being in a class or talking with other people or any of those type of things. It just automatically, comes to mind, and I start running those things back. And that's a good way of saying that now our hard drives are kicking in. I know you got a new computer and switching files and all that stuff, but think about what it takes to pull that information back out about the lessons that we know. And one of the challenging pieces here is, as our younger generation's coming in, and some of the time period that is, what we grew up on and cut our teeth with and learned from is now dissipating very quickly in the shadows and is not as prevalent as what it used to be, but it still has the relevance that we need to be discussing. And I think that's one of the things that this series we're doing, especially tonight, when we start talking about lessons learned and going back to the things like the wall bombs, the Vendome, talking about the Southwest Supermarket store we talked about, in the 5th part series, going to, fires that were in like the Total Computer Center that I was at when we got all entangled up inside the building. Yeah. Those are lessons learned that it's important for us as individuals, especially as instructors, Chris, to share. But again, it's important for all these other aspects that are out there with the near misses and the NOSH reports that we're being students and learning from those events.
One of the things that we've been continuing to discuss here on Buildings on Fire, both on both of our respective programs, on Fire and Training with Chief Cline, and certainly here on Buildings on Fire, is the continuing challenges that are associated with the commercial fireground, commercial buildings, commercial occupancies, and more importantly, the lessons and learnings that have been drawn out of those events over the decades and in the years of time. One of the things that has been common to our conversation in our previous episodes and series leading up to our final episode here is that all of these particular occupancies have significant degrees of risks. Those risks, again, become very evident as companies arrive on scene and size up the buildings, determine risk factors based upon the severity, and start engaging into the structure. We've talked about strategy, we've talked about tactics, we've talked about risk factors, we've talked about building construction, we've talked about the global issues affecting the small standalone commercial building all the way up to the big box structures. And one of the things that Doug and I wanted to really sort of pull together here on our final episode for this series were some of the lessons, learnings, and leadership that are drawn out of the Commercial Fireground. And more importantly, just talk about some of the pertinent examples that, again, some of our listeners may be familiar with, certainly the one that will lead off here in a moment, but also a few that resonate when we talk about those types of commercial buildings that are pretty common, the fast food type stores and responses, or some of the smaller strip malls and commercial buildings that are out there that continue to stress, challenge, and demand a high degree of respect on the fireground when we do respond. So, Doug, again, I want to thank you for certainly being part of this phenomenal series. We had a great opportunity to think about what we wanted to say in the early stages and phases of this particular program, and then we quickly recognized that we had to expand this series out to be what it is, and that was the 6-part series for all of our programs, which we're culminating here in our final episode on lessons and learnings from the Commercial Fireground. So some lead-in comments as we get into our discussion here on this episode.
Well, Chris, and the way we've been approaching this is taking basically the totality of the picture look. And, when we're looking at lessons and learning, I think there's a lot that comes back to that. In lesson 5, we talked about wall bombs. We talked about several other events. And I think this is where we really dive into letting our listeners know just how important the lessons are that are from our past. Part of what we're seeing is in our time period, when we were cutting our teeth, when we were coming along, some of the responses we went to, some of the big events that occurred during our time frame that we learned from those folks that were just phenomenal individuals that were teaching are starting to fall into the shadows or the wayside. And I think that can't happen. And, things like the Super Sofa Store in Charleston or the Southwest Supermarket, the Vendome in Boston. We go back to wall bombs. We talk about a lot of these that are there, and I think that's something that we have to really dive into and talk more about. And our listeners need to be looking at the NIOS reports and learning. And I go back to what I learned on running some of the calls and the Total Computer Center when I was in Chapel Hill and being, wrapped up in all those wires. And I talked about cutting them loose. And, those are lessons learned that we've got to share with people so that they're learning vicariously from us, but also it's lessons. What did we gain out of that event occurring? And even when, we're honoring those that paid the ultimate sacrifice, what are we learning from those type of events, especially on these commercial structures, which are very, very challenging?
Well, I think to talk about, when we talk about Fireground legacy, and probably the most significant event in our generation of the fire service, if we go back to the Sofa Superstore fire in Charleston, South Carolina, from June 18th of 2007, which resulted in 9 line-of-duty deaths of our firefighters and our brothers in Charleston. For many of our listeners, Doug, you and I have, as we travel around and as we present, continue to see some of the challenges regarding the fading of these lessons. And again, we're talking about 2007. It is rather significant. It seems like it was only yesterday when we talk about that date, but we've all gone beyond the 10th anniversary, and as we start approaching almost the next significant milestone here, a most significant event in its standpoint of 2007, and certainly going into the next 8 to 10 year period of time, all the way up to 2017 and so forth. 9 line-of-duty deaths, commercial buildings, significant examples and lessons, learnings, examples that promote the positive and things that promote the negative. And in all due respect to, again, the fire service, the fire department in Charleston, our listeners really need to take a look at the 3 reports. There were 3 significant reports, and although we can't get into the level of detail on this particular episode as we might like, I would encourage our listeners to take a look at 3 specific reports that were paramount at that time and continue to be very relevant today. First and foremost, I believe the NIOSH report would provide some insights that the general firefighter, general officer, chief officer out there can glean a tremendous degree of insights on the parameters of that event, the details of the operation, and more importantly, the recommendations and the learnings that came out of that report. It's much easier of a read relative to that NIOSH report, and that's accessible right directly from the NIOSH Firefighter Line of Duty Death website. The second report, which provides a wealth and depth of aspects, was the Routley report, and that was titled after Gordon Routley, who was the main facilitator of that report. They brought in a number of different subject matter experts and developed a baseline report of everything that led up to that report, as well as looked at other cultural related issues affecting that operations and the outcome. But a significant, I think, watershed report that looked at a lot of different elements, but again, delved into some very specifics. And then thirdly, the NIST report. The NIST report really delved into some details regarding building performance, the fire dynamics, and other related aspects. But if nothing else, I think what our program here in this episode should be all about is certainly honoring the legacy of the Charleston 9 as it relates back to a commercial building and the various aspects that we've been talking about here throughout our other 5 episodes. So, Doug, coming out of South Carolina, certainly the aspects of this particular event and the learnings. I think the learnings nationally, when we take a look at what precipitated the American Fire Service or even the North American Fire Service to do a stop and adjust. We all have similar buildings, and what occurred in that particular city at that particular time still are present and relevant here in 2024 in any jurisdiction, whether we talk about a small rural setting, with a dollar store in Beckley, West Virginia, or whether it be something in the Grand Strand or something across the United States in the West Coast or Northeast or anywhere in between, right? I mean, there's relevancy here of significant takeaways when we talk about commercial buildings and much of what we've been talking about right along.
Well, I definitely agree, Chris. There's so much that can be learned and gained from these. And, looking back at the Charleston, I studied that event significantly at the time period. Having a little bit of insight, being a little bit involved with it, one of the things that I really looked at very, very strongly was being a fire chief in a city that had furniture production, that had a lot of textile industry, things like that very closely resembled that building and that type of occupancy and that type of fire loading and the potential of what could occur to us. I really looked at that in what I would call finite detail. And it really changed the perspective of, hey, what are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? And what do we need to prepare people for? And, one of the things, and this is a mentality that exists, and I'm going to speak facts, is that when I wanted to take the Routley report and, another one of the reports, have folks read it and mandate that they read it, I got some pushback. And I got some pushback from some of the folks that had been around for a long period of time, to the point that council was like, nobody around us is requiring this to be read. And when I had the conversation with the city manager, it was like, I really don't care if anybody else around us is having it read or not. It's very applicable to us. It's things that could affect our city, our infrastructure of the city, the financial components of the city. can impact into, us having line of duty deaths potentially. It needs to be operationally looked at for tactical deployments and realizing what we would do. And needless to say, I kind of lost that battle. Unfortunately, I lost it significantly with the political venue, but I attacked it in a different way. I had the opportunity to actually have a commercial structure that we could do some live fire training in. And of course, the first thing that I wanted to do is, okay, how do we create lessons learned that we're learning vicariously from somebody else? And what are some of the impacts that can occur with that? So I was very, very fortunate to have one of the Office of State Fire Marshal trainers, people that work for them, that develop curriculum, that evaluated and tested programs to actually be one of the volunteers within my combination organization there. And Greg Chatham and I got together, and he was very, very good with live fire. And, we had burned a lot with inside the city training people. And I went to him and said, okay, how do we do this? How do we get this, structure to the point that we can do certain levels of training to accomplish these objectives? And one of the objectives was getting people to understand how hard it is to deploy in a building any length of distance, where you got to make a couple of turns and things like that. The other side of the fence was, in Series 5, we talked about the types of ceilings and drop ceilings and things that are protecting, the structure itself, and what happens if they fail. And we had a lot of drop ceilings in that area, and a lot of that flexible ductwork that's in the ceilings. It was an older style design, and it was like, these people have never really seen that because they've not had this level of fire. They've not experienced these type of things. So we worked very, very difficultly to make this a safe environment, which we went through the process. We worked with even the code side to strip the structure, except for the rooms. We created barriers where they couldn't go into the rooms, except, they could actually flow water over them. Showed what happened when these ceilings would fall and come down, showed them the complexities of it, showed them what happened with the reaction of the water on the ceilings. And we did this from the light of day into the cloak of darkness, because it does change the impact of things in the building. And I wanted folks to have to experience that. And we did a lot of burning. We brought a lot of people in. We brought a lot of folks in from the state. And lo and behold, we had a great time, first of all, in the training. The biggest part, the impact came about 3 weeks later when we had a commercial structure. And it was not a small box, Chris, but this was a shoebox. It was like a convenience store. It wasn't as big as a Dollar General, but it had all the components that we had. And when they got there, they recognized we need to hold up. We don't need to necessarily go in. We need to flow water from the exterior. We're at the point this is going to occur based upon the knowledge they gained from that. So lessons learned from a training applied from the lessons learned in fire behavior and the complexities that came out of Charleston, and trying not to have a history repeating event under my watch as a fire chief. And again, that was very disheartening as a fire chief to have the political arena jump in and say, we don't need to do this, or this isn't important, when they're not the experts, but we're learning from the experts. And there were some phenomenal people that worked on those reports, and very, very knowledgeable people. And again, there was a lot of lessons, some of them that we necessarily didn't want to hear. Some of them were things that were just heart-wrenching as far as what we got. But, again, to honor those 9 people, we're obligated to learn from that. And that's just my opinion. And we even take our recruits to Charleston.
Well, and again, Doug, you make some great points. When we talk about history, relationships, the fading lessons unfortunately fade too quickly. And one of the points that I wanted to bring up here in the beginning as we talk about, as we get further and further away from events, whether it be on the local or national level, those events do fade back into history, and we don't have the ability to recall the lessons, the learnings, the best practices, the challenges, and be able to apply some of those regarding the events of the day. And in other words, I think that when we take a look at, although the continuing trend of commercial buildings is unabated, we are seeing more and more commercial structures of a variety of sizes and complexities, especially with hybrid construction coming about in all jurisdictions, no matter where you go, from the most ruralist to the most urban and ultra-urban types of settings. And the one thing I think is also resonating is that there no longer is a template for today's commercial buildings. There is much more of a continuing trend toward a variety of hybrid-related conditions and constructions and features in the building, both from an engineering, architectural, aesthetic standpoint, that the only way we're going to be able to possibly select the right attributes of strategy, tactics, tactical windows, deployment, hand lines, gallon per minute flow rates, whatever it may be, is to try to connect some of the patterns and the dots that are in front of us by those indicators. In other words, we're sizing up, we're looking at a footprint, we're looking at an occupancy, we're looking at a particular business by name, and trying to recall some lessons and learnings, both from either reports, after action reports, line of duty deaths, textbooks, wherever those resources may be, or the kitchen table conversations, or the conversations and presentations at conferences, taking all of that in place to be able to give us some suggested avenues and directions to go based upon sort of a hybrid recognition prime decision making, right? We either don't have that experience, or we're trying to put it all together based upon the new event that we have. The one thing that all of these share when we talk about lessons and learnings is that we have high-risk events with low-frequency occurrences. And although the frequency in some jurisdictions is increasing, it may not always be the best practice by what you are doing, even though you may have had a success in the past. So it's really being on top of your game each and every time. One of the things that we wanted to talk a little bit about here in this episode is just to give you, our listeners, a couple of different insights. So we talked about two very prominent events, the Phoenix, Arizona, Phoenix Fire Department's Brett Tarver line of duty death at the Southwest Inn Fire. And then we just mentioned the 2007 9 line of duty deaths at the Charleston Sofa Superstore fire in Charleston, South Carolina. Both of those, I believe, are probably the most significant events relative to the lessons and learnings, and how both of those events truly changed the way we were doing business and hopefully are continuing to do business regarding the commercial fireground. One event that was very pinnacle back in the early era of the fire service, and again, although it seems like yesterday for some of us, it is going back quite a number of years. And that event was the Sunrise Gift Store fire that occurred in Orange County, Florida, and that occurred on February 24th of 1989. That particular event in a small footprint commercial structure, which was, again, a gift shop, which is very common for that area. We'll explain a little bit more about that here in a moment, resulted in a double line of duty death, both of an acting lieutenant, Lieutenant Todd Aldridge, and also a firefighter paramedic, Mark Benj. And both of those lost their lives while in the early stages of a very fast developing fire that all started off with just a single engine response to a report of a smoke odor in a gift shop. And for many of our listeners who have traveled to Orlando and to the Disneyland area, this particular structure is just an innocuous building that's just a couple of blocks off of Interstate 4 as you get off the interstate to make a turn to go to what used to be the original hotel streets or hotel row there in Disney before downtown Disney was built and such. But as you travel off the interstate to make a turn to go to downtown Disney, or I think it's called a different term currently, just one block up off of that intersection was the location of the Sunrise gift shop fire. It currently has been reconstructed. There is a convenience store and a pizza shop that's located in there. And I'll tell you, Doug, for many, many years prior to putting a couple of things together, I had visited that particular property where nothing is mentioned, nothing is honoring the loss of 2 firefighters in the line of duty. But when we were visiting that particular area and staying at an area hotel, I frequented that particular property on that hallowed ground many times over many years, and not recognizing until a number of years later that was the site that had been rebuilt that we are talking about here for the February 24th, 1989 fire. So that particular event, again, began with just an engine company responding for a report of a smoke odor. And as we talked about in the last episode, Doug, when we talked about concealed spaces, this fire was located and had been burning for a considerable length of time in a concealed area up above the gypsum wallboard that was part of the compartment. And unfortunately, that compartment, again, very common in the 1989 era, was all of very lightweight engineered wood construction, a very significantly large voided space. That fire was just smoldering along until the company arrived, went into an investigation mode, and what do you think ended up happening next? So as they don't have a tick camera at the time, but again, they're popping the ceiling to identify what and where that odor may have originated from, and in doing so, introduce some additional oxygen into that space. A very catastrophic explosion ends up occurring, trapping all of those firefighters in that location. So it was interesting to note that particular event led to a considerable amount of conversation in the American Fire Service concerning voided spaces, limited responsive manpower, because again, as a single unit response at the time, there was no additional resources available due to the fact that this now went from an investigation to a very large-scale catastrophic event with trapped firefighters, and the engineer was the only other individual who could go back to the engine and call, again, one of the survivors, to call for additional resources unbeknownst to the 911 center.
Let's stop and think about just that one little piece. And again, I'm not beating anybody up, but it's reality. How many times do volunteer fire departments across the United States or the world respond with one truck and about 3 people to even fires?
Yep.
It's reality. And, I hate to keep using this analogy this past weekend of talking to folks, but it's relevant in my mind, and it is a rural setting. And even in some of the urbanized settings of where I was at in West Virginia, they still don't send that many people to fires. And again, 3-4 people during the day on a fire in West Virginia, you're 20 minutes, 30 minutes of getting some help sometimes. And, these were the conversations that we're having about the tactics that we talked about, the considerations. But, even throughout some of these lessons learned, and I use this particular case as part of the conversation, is they went to a smoke investigation. How many times have you been dispatched to a smoke investigation? And I go back to, I was dispatched to a smoke investigation, and basically a smell of smoke in the building. And I happened to be, we sent 2 trucks. I mean, that was what we sent. So the first crew went up and they were met with a bunch of smoke. Almost sounds like Adams away in Memphis, Tennessee on the automatic alarm that they've been to 20 plus times in that month. So again, that level of complacency can kick in, and these are the lessons that are lost. And I just go back, and it's hard to believe that 1993, yesterday, was the World Trade Center bombing. You go back and talk about this event, even a few years before that. You go back and talk about events with Charleston, how long ago that's actually been. It's scary to think that time has actually moved that fast on us, Chris. I mean,
that's for certain.
It's like it was yesterday that these things occurred in our minds, but it's yet the gap is huge. And how many people even know about this particular incident we're talking about in Orange County? Or
Well,
that's a problem.
And it is a big problem. And this was a very, very significant event in that era of time, specifically because of two factors. Number one, the continuing issue with staffing levels. As staffing started becoming reduced, it became very common to start having 3-person staffed units respond out as they did there. And then secondly, the aspects of a commercial building with lightweight engineered or lightweight frame construction. So those things, again, were all common to a continuing thread of conversation dealing with the vulnerabilities of our buildings, the aspects of fire loads, the aspects of tactical approaches, and then the staffing level of what one can do and not to do, and then the delays that come about. So, in this instance, we have the engineer who survives. He ends up calling out the additional resources necessary to fill out the box, which there is a delay, that fire continues to grow and so forth. So unfortunately, we end up having an acting lieutenant who, that in itself, you're going to hear this in another moment here when we talk about the next lesson from another case study in which, think of it this way, we have company officers who are trained, commanding officers who are trained, skilled, and develop their skill sets in that role and responsibility. It continues to be even more challenging when we have individuals who are riding out of role and in positions or riding up, as it was in this instance, where you have an acting officer who may have other challenges along with what's being encountered with the fire. And this will be important to note that there's another event that occurred in a commercial building where we had another acting officer. So although there may be some commonalities, there may be differences there, but it's just certainly something that one should always consider when we talk about experience, other related aspects. The only other thing I'll add in this particular event from Orange County was that it wasn't until 2009 in which Florida finally had the wherewithal to pass some legislation that had been stalled out for many, many years, again, almost 2 decades. But in 2009, the Florida legislature was able to pass the Aldridge-Benjay Firefighter Safety Act, which in the state of Florida now required placarding for commercial buildings for both floors, roofs, and roof and or floor systems in those structures that had lightweight engineered components to them. So again, another testament which comes on the heels of another fire that, although not specific to our conversation here, but when we talk about the events that occurred in July of 1988 in Hackensack, New Jersey, for the Hackensack Ford fire, where again a heavy timbered constructed roof system ends up failing, and again that led to the placarding of truss roofs in the state of New Jersey, specific to the 5 line of duty deaths that occurred at that particular event. But again, for those of you that do go back to Florida on some frequency, take a look at the areas directly on the side of the door, and you'll find an 8-inch Maltese cross that will indicate a light frame or a truss light construction system that may be present either in the roof, floor, and or roof and floor component systems. That leads us into another line of duty death and another lessons here that we wanted to make reference to, and that was in an auto parts store that occurred on March 18th in 1996. And for many of our listeners, again, you may recall conversations and discussions dealing with the event that occurred in Chesapeake Bay, Virginia, and that dealt with a roof failure. And that occurred in Chesapeake Bay, Virginia, for Virginia Fire and Rescue, with a result of a commercial structure with a roof failure that, again, in a similar fashion, Doug, that initially was called out with a single engine response and resulted in a double line of duty death of an acting lieutenant, Lieutenant Frank Young, and firefighter specialist John Hudgens, who lost their lives while investigating, again, a smoke odor in the back of that commercial store, lightweight construction, and a series of cascading events. So, these events continue to occur, but especially the ones that are in the past. We just are not recognizing the importance of what they played out in that time and how they continue to influence our operations. That event also led to a placarding system in the Commonwealth of Virginia for the identification of truss roofs and floor systems for commercial buildings. Doug, when I talk about fast food restaurants and such, what's the first thing that comes to mind when we talk about this whole lessons learning and issues dealing with the commercial fireground? What have we learned about fast food establishments, generically or generally speaking?
Well, one of the things that comes to mind is there is an event with line of duty deaths that has a NIOSH report about it. But the thing that comes to my mind most is these buildings are considered disposable buildings. And in fact, a lot of these owners or these franchises don't even carry insurance on the building because it is a disposable building, and it gets replaced on an average about every 12 to 15 years. It gets completely redone, tore down, put back. One of the other pieces that comes to mind is how they're built, in a construction feature. Again, a lot of engineered systems that are in those buildings, but stop and think about the occupancy, but also the type of fire loading you have in there and what can occur. And again, easy to get lost and disoriented in a couple of those places, especially in cold smoke, for those McDonald's and Burger Kings and Arby's and all those different places. And now a good example is some of these places, and I saw one in I think it was in Beaufort, South Carolina. It's a 2-story McDonald's. So, that changes the whole dimensions of what you're talking about. And, there's history repeating events to like the auto parts store. There was a line of duty death outside of Goldsboro, North Carolina. We've seen multiple, injuries and deaths that have occurred in fast food restaurants. It's not uncommon. So, again, a lot of times our tactics that we're finding are residential tactics being deployed on commercial structures. And that's a big commonality that has showed up in some of the NIOSH reports. And again, it's an experience level, I think, that plays into that. And it's also a complacency factor of how we train. We don't train for commercial buildings. We train typically for residential structures. And again, I use the term we're a street front door fire department a lot of times.
Well, you mentioned disposable structures, and that's exactly where I was expecting you to lead us to. But another significant event that occurred on March 14th of 2000, so about 24 years ago, we're just coming up to the anniversary here. And this was a lessons and learnings from the fireground on a commercial building at a McDonald's restaurant, fast food restaurant. And that in itself, I think, really established this criteria because there was quite a bit of conversation concerning structures that truly have no value, although they fall within the domains of what we, the fire service, are expected to do. But in this instance, truly it exemplified the fact that there was a double line of duty death, unfortunately, as a result of operations in an unoccupied structure occurring up in a concealed area. And again, the uniqueness of construction of these particular types of standalones, lightweight engineered construction, and more importantly, the presence of the rooftop unit and the fact that personnel were operating underneath that structure, not entirely aware of how the buildings were built, the levels of risks, and unfortunately, the sequence of events as that tactical window continued on. 2 firefighters, both at the rank of firefighters, lost their lives. Lewis Mayo and Kimberly Ann Smith both lost their lives on March 14th of 2000 during the conduct of operations, where a rooftop unit ended up falling through the concealed area of that parallel core trusses up above, and both injuring and then subsequently killing both firefighters within the interior confines of that building. The NIOSH report is very explicit, getting into significant recommendations, and I think the most significant recommendation that resonates today is that we have recognized that Some buildings truly are disposable in this instance, as many others. There is no value. The building is going to be leveled. New building will be built in its entirely very, very quickly for most of these franchises and or businesses. And again, there is a significant level of what we are sacrificing for buildings that are disposable. And then we'll just sort of leave it at that. There's conversations, these dialogues over many, many years, but that, I believe, really exemplified the state, the conversation, and what we continue to have debates on about buildings and what is worth the life of a firefighter. And again, if you were to look at the International Association of Fire Chiefs, Safety and Survival learnings, again, the first rule of engagement is no building is worth the life of a firefighter. And rule number 10 in the early vintages of that report, item number 10 was no building is worth the life of a firefighter. So a lot of significance when we take a look at those particular aspects to it, lessons and learnings that come out of that particular standpoint. Fast forward a little bit when we've talked about a variety of different building types, but one of the other very, very significant lesson, and I believe we'll just try to focus a little bit more on this. There's two particular events that our listeners should invest some time and energy on, and this report came out of NIOSH report F 2013-14, from a fire that occurred in a strip mall in the metropolitan area of Detroit, just outside of Detroit, actually in Westland, Detroit. And one single probationary firefighter lost his life in that particular event, and due to a structural collapse and a series of issues affecting a building that, in this instance, a very conventional strip mall, only 100 foot deep from front to rear, and the loss of life of Brian Wolke, who, again, was operating on the end of a hose line. So think of it this way, right, Doug? We talk about getting on-the-job training, especially in commercial buildings where we don't have that frequency. We talk about staffing levels with individuals riding the engine. We have other individuals riding the ambulance, and again, culminating and getting those appropriate balance of resources when the alarm is unfolding. And that's what occurred here. We had firefighter Wolke is riding the ambulance. We have a contingent of response on the first alarm. We have personnel that come together to start operating in a very fast developing fire, which unfortunately, unbeknownst to anybody, was a arson-based fire, which unfortunately contributed significantly to the catastrophic series of events. But I would encourage our listeners to take a look and really do a deep dive in this particular report due to the extensive amount of detail on construction issues that we've talked about in our previous episodes, some things that we talked about in our episode 5 on tactics, some things that we talked about on risks in one of our episodes, and then what we did, right, I think, Doug, right on episode number 2 when we talked about building construction. So commercial building, strip mall, very conventional, that most of our listeners have similar types of structures, conventional types of roof decking, steel bar joist construction, concrete masonry units, a fire that's only 50 feet in from the front door. They're 50 foot in, about midpoint into the structure, another 50 feet to the back portion of the building. But again, common to many of our commercial buildings with both voided spaces in the ceiling that this had, then also rooftop units, right? So this continues the common thread, Doug, that we've been talking about. Lessons, learnings, building features, fire dynamics, the aspects of where we're operating. And unfortunately, the series of events in this instance, they're 50 foot in from the front door. Senior personnel are backing up the probationary firefighter. He's on the nozzle trying to gain experience of nozzle time in a deep-seated fire with a lot of challenges. But as the conditions started deteriorating and they could hear the structural steel starting to move, wall displacement, and the early stages of collapse, what was imminent collapse, the high degree of training kicked in for the senior members who instinctively turned and moved in the direction of travel where the hose line, and quickly were able to get to the doorway before the area became uninhabitable by the collapse. The probationary firefighter who was on the nozzle obviously the report identifies some challenges and did not have this type of predetermined instinctive kind of direction and movement, and unfortunately ended up losing his life right there on the nozzle, 50 feet away from that structure. So, these are lessons that resonate with everything we've talked about throughout all 5 of our episodes, do they not, Doug?
Absolutely, they do. And just go back to what we said multiple times is the experience, and this is happening as we speak. A lot of the experience that exists within departments are leaving. They're retiring out. They're no longer there. They're giving up the volunteerism side. Their health may prevent them from responding to calls, and we go back to the America burning concept and report from Engine Company 81 and the time periods that we went to a lot of fires and all these lessons learned. We experienced a lot of that, Chris, unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know which it is, but we're the folks that live through those errors and have a lot of this knowledge, just like these people did. They recognized the signs, went out. Part of what I think that needs to occur more of is sharing of those experiences. And, a lot of times, people talk, oh, those are war stories. Those are, that's all you do is tell war stories, where there's value in what's in the war story if you're relating it to the concepts. And so to speak, in 6 episodes now, Chris, we've kind of told war stories that are relevant to the topics that we're conversing about specifically. But this is a common thread, that there are people that identify and recognize and react, and there's other folks that just do not have that knowledge. And unfortunately, you just don't gain that knowledge unless you learn it from somebody and you react to that. And I told a story about Chief Jerry Tracy from FDNY and the can of beans that, he pulled out of the cabinet, and he was and I remember this was probably 30 years ago, whatever it was. And he talked about putting it on the floor, and he was, in tenement housing and type 3 conditions, things like that. But again, that's a commercial structure for us. As we're talking about it, it could be a taxpayer in commercial structures, and just those little things. He put it on the floor to see what the floor did, if the can rolled, and being uneven, and why is it uneven, and the recognition of those things. And, fortunately, that is a big piece for us and looking at this. And what we're talking about are repeating events. This has happened more than just once. And unfortunately, we don't talk about it enough. I don't think the fire service talks about it enough. And I don't think company officers, who are the true trainers of the fire service, are utilizing all these nice reports and near misses and these historic events to make relevance to their districts. And I think that's where we've got to get these folks doing more. Unfortunately, this was something that was said the other day, is that now we're seeing people being promoted to that company officer that gets a stripe on their sleeve, but doesn't even have enough time to have a star, which is typically 5 years. And that is a common thread that we're seeing across the United States. And I don't remember who wrote this or had it in an article, but it was in one of the fire engineering articles. They were talking about most first arriving officers now that are being promoted to first arriving officers, or that first level of company officer, don't have 5 first due working fires under their belt. Now, they may have been the third due, the fourth due, whatever it is, but they've not been the first due arriving apparatus to see some of those decisions being made. And they even equate that to, they've probably not even seen one commercial fire.
Yeah. And again, I think the challenge continues to be that we have protected properties by code that lessens the potential susceptibility in terms of frequency. So protected properties, better codes, and other levels of both life safety and related conditions But when we do see those frequencies due to either economic stressors, other related factors, the frequency of those commercial building fires in certain areas of the country, first dues, municipalities, becomes very frequent, becomes very, very severe, and we see a lot of destruction and damage, and hopefully limiting the degree of potential injuries. But the one thing I think we recognize time and time again through our conversations is that these buildings do create very susceptible levels of risk. They do require and demand a high degree of respect, and more importantly, even a higher degree of preparation, both in terms of training and then knowledge-based and skill-based particular elements. One of the things that I pulled together here quickly that I pulled up, Doug, was some things that we've talked about amongst all of our different programs, and it's sort of just a running list. And I think what we'll do is I'll get a screenshot of a couple of these, and we'll get them up in the up on our social media pages and up on Fire Engineering, sort of to help round out our conversation here for our series. And I'll actually repost a couple of different diagrams that we made available. I think it was on series 2 or 3 when we did either risk and or building construction, which was a couple of cross sections that we worked up regarding some generalizations. But quickly, I just want to cover a couple of things here. I'm just going to run through these bullets relative to some of the challenges that have come out as a result of lessons and learnings and best practices. And again, just from a listener standpoint, just listen to what those bullets are and try to connect to what they may have relative to their relevancy to you. In other words, are you able to internalize something here that has some degree of importance that might require you to take another look at some things, or maybe delve into something, or something that triggers a more of a concern regarding some of the buildings that you may have. So some of these challenges are inclusive of, again, both the footprint, the size, the volume, the number of program spaces. We talked about the number of tenant spaces, the spaces that are up above when we have multiple stories, commercial buildings, as well as tenant spaces that might be adjacent, front, back to our building. So it's that standalone to the variety of complex program spaces. The identifying the complexity of construction, the structural spans, the number of bays, the open and closedness of that particular building. The fact that these buildings are very susceptible to both compromise and collapse, and are highly vulnerable to both heat and fire exposure. So again, we talked about the compartment, we talked about the volume and the square footages. Doug, you talked extensively about fire dynamics. You also talked about tactical mobility and some of the limitations. And then we also talked extensively in our episodes about the life safety threat to not only the civilians, but also to the workers, and that equates back to the occupancy load. We've talked about fire load and the risk and the threat to fire, the aspects of the exposures to those buildings, and one of the most elusive issues dealing with the aspects of time. Tactical time and tactical windows. We have limited opportunities to get engaged. We also have a much greater degree of time that's going to elapse while we enter, move through the building, performing the 360, getting up into the structure, moving through exposures, and so forth. Structural integrity, critical component when we talk about operational considerations. The time to deploy. We just talked about the aspects of that limited manpower resource arriving on scene. You've got to fill out the box. If you don't have an adequacy and a robustness of resources on that first alarm, you will always be somewhat behind that 8 ball. Be aware of potential for a rapid fire spread, especially due to the openness of the structure, and be aware of both be aware of the fire loading, both in terms of the building's material as well as the commodities that are going to be in that particular structure. Be highly sensitive to the effectiveness of both sustained and initial fire flows. What do you have available for that initial fire flow, and then the sustainability based upon the operations. And then more importantly, be aware that the fire may not be able to be mitigated and controlled before compromise occurs, or before that incident escalates into a much higher level of an operation. Be aware of the fixed suppression system's operability and the design, and whether that design is appropriate for the change in the building's occupancy usage, right? So, Doug, how many buildings have changed occupancy around the area in your particular response location there in Horry County, in terms of one business going out, a new business coming in, and how many times has that changed over the number of years?
Well, let's just break it down to a year. That may be 2 or 3 times in just a year's time period.
And again, so with that being said, so that being said, is the fixed systems design up to par with what the new occupancy usage may be? I think we've talked a little bit about the false sense of fire severity and the risk in our commercial buildings, the need for air management, the need possibly for tethered lines, being aware of vent paths, flow paths, and so forth. And there is no definitive tactical template for commercial firefighting. I think it's safe to say, and I think we both are advocates of this, is that what may work in one jurisdiction regarding a particular commercial tactical template in terms of resources, strategy, tactics, and so forth, may only work in that particular area based upon the composition and the availability of resources, the staffing levels, the training levels, and so forth. So you have to be very, very cautious when we take a look at what others are doing. There's going to be some good best practices, but also modify and take into account what it is that you're trying to do in your particular department, your jurisdiction, your region, your community, as it relates to all of those other particular variables and factors that certainly may be present. So a lot of different pieces that are going to be put into place. And I think Doug we'll do some screenshots of some of those and get those things posted up to help benefit our listeners that are out there.
I think that's a great idea, Chris. And again, take those points, go back and review, look at case studies, look at your jurisdiction, look at history repeating events in your jurisdiction that may not have injuries or line of duty deaths, but things that you're seeing, the changes you're seeing, the changes in buildings and occupancy. I think you take every bit of this and you begin analyzing your jurisdiction and start connecting the dots of what are the issues, what are the problems, what are the challenges, what are we going to do when the tones drop at 2:00 in the morning? What are we going to do?
Yeah. And I would say this as we're starting to get into our closing conversation here, another very significant event, really looking at and facing the hard lessons, was a single line of duty death, again, in a commercial occupancy, occurred in San Antonio, Texas on March 18th of 2017. There are 2 reports that came out of that, the NIOSH report that was issued in 2018, then also the Texas State Fire Marshal's report that can be obtained through the Texas Fire Marshal's website in the state of Texas. But 2 of those reports surrounded the events that occurred in a Type 2 commercial retail building. Again, unfortunately, there was an arson-related chain of events that occurred, but there was fire, there was entrapment, there was a mayday, there was a collapse, and there are significant, very pointed lessons that are drawn out of this report that I think would very appropriately honor the line of duty death of firefighter Scott Deem, who was the firefighter in San Antonio that lost his life there in 2007. I would really encourage our listeners to read this report, as it is the other reports there from Michigan, the Phoenix report for Brett Tarver, and then certainly any one of the Charleston reports that we've made mention of. But these reports, I believe, resonate significantly with everything that we've talked about, and more importantly, the lessons and learnings that are drawn out of these reports, along with many others. There was the quadruple line of duty death that occurred in Houston, Texas in 2013, again in a commercial building that at the time resulted in 4 line of duty deaths, along with a subsequent line of duty death of a captain who lost his life a number of years later due to the exposure and the events that occurred. So the lessons are out there. It's really incumbent upon each of our listeners to, number one, be aware of those reports, as we've talked about here, Doug, right? Not to have a potential history repeating event. And there are numerous other similar commercial-related building fires that again, the NISH reports in particular that did lead to LODDs can provide some lessons and learnings and connect these dots. I think the one most critical aspect here to talk about when we refer back to the lessons and learnings, and this was drawn out of a University of Georgia report that took a deep dive into all of the line of duty deaths, and they came up with 4 root cause analysis. And I'll just give you the one that relates back here to our commercial conversation. And that goes back to this. It's primarily was focusing in on commanding officers, but it's inclusive of both commanding as well as company officers. Anyone that's in charge, that's on the initial alarm, that's setting up the initial action plan, identifying the tactics and going into a task mode, or the incident commander that's developing the incident action plan, the strategies, and setting the stage out for the operations. And they identified this. They identified that it's the inability for incident commanders to identify those subtleties of an evolving incident, recognize what those subtleties of that event are, and react upon them before the event escalates up into a serious condition. In other words, commanding officers are not recognizing the precursors for adverse conditions and acting upon them before they occur, and being able to hopefully change the outcome or potentially change the direction of the incident. Specifically in commercial buildings, if we're not looking at subtle or very apparent indicators, not recognizing what we are seeing, not understanding the construction, not balancing out the levels of risk, we're going to miss those opportunities to do a correct check and adjust, or even to identify the right things that we should be doing in the initial stages. We are really good at reacting to Mayday, I got a collapse, I got a flashover, got whatever it may be, and reacting to them. We are not really good on the front end of all of that. And that really sort of revolves around everything that we've been talking about, right, Doug? The risk factors, risk profiling, stuff that Chief Brunacini talked about, lessons out of the reports, and then our experiences that have really been drawn out of all of these respective areas.
Absolutely. And, the biggest thing is we need to connect those dots. We need to go back and recognize some of the continuing issues that can occur. The information that we do have at hand that we can learn from, and then the biggest thing is applying it. And this is just a hair offbeat, Chris, but within the last week we had the Loudoun County explosion. Lessons learned. We back the clock up to January the 30th in 2007, and 2 line of duty deaths of emergency responders, 2 gas technicians, that the explosion at the little general store in Gent, West Virginia, just not far from where Pipestem is actually held. We had the privilege, you and I, of having one of the children of one of those responders in her class a number of years ago. But again, these are connecting those type of dots of what have we learned through the years, and how do we impact or affect change in what we're doing in our thought processes or our training.
I think it's safe to say that our attempt here was to identify some issues that are out there. We continue, as we've mentioned in our previous episodes, that we're not having nearly enough of a conversation on the commercial fireground, let alone having enough conversation in any number of other areas. We continue to identify, Doug, on your program on fire and training, opportunities and avenues to enhance training, focus, to develop skill set levels, to enhance our operability on the fireground. On Buildings on Fire, we continue to talk about the built environment and the aspects dealing with occupancy types, occupancy risks. And in this series, again, our goal was to, if nothing else, increase some perspective, increase a heightened degree of awareness on a number of different facets revolving around a very demanding commercial fireground condition, and hopefully giving you the listeners, some insights to hopefully delve into other layers and opportunities for skill, knowledge, skill set development, education, just taking it a next step further from where you were before you tuned in and became aware of some things. We have only scratched the surface, and we look forward to bringing you some additional multi-part series as we continue into the current year here on fireengineering.com on the podcast and webcast series. We have FDIC coming up here in a very, very short period of time where we'll both be presenting. We look forward to meeting many of you there on the floor at FDIC. We also have a scheduled live pod and webcast program that we'll be doing later in that week at FDIC. And again, we'll get that posted and the schedule's up here shortly. But we look forward to being able to speak with many of our listeners face-to-face, either in the formality of our classroom programs that both Doug and I are going to be presenting at, as well as the unofficial, casual kind of conversations there in the hallways, outside the classrooms, and certainly within and around the streets of Indy. I would be remiss if I did not thank Fire Engineering for the opportunity to give us this latitude to really delve into some things that I think are very important to the fire service, and that reflects highly on everyone that's involved with Fire Engineering, the staff, the management, the oversight, the behind-the-scenes people, and so forth. Again, our continued thanks for this opportunity to continue to have a voice in the training and education and the well-being of the fire service. I'll just give you actually, no, Doug, I'll just let you get. So closing thoughts on the series.
Well, I think, again, we just scratched the surface, Chris. I think that's a good way to put it. So much to talk about. Not enough time on the show to talk about, but hopefully what we've done has sparked your interest, that you begin having the tailboard conversations, the kitchen table talks over a cup of coffee, analyzing and strategizing about your districts, your people, their knowledge, the tactics that are being deployed, what capabilities you have, what you don't have, looking dynamically at the challenges that are in front of you in your buildings, the types of buildings, and are you prepared to do that? So again, as we always say, Chris, you got to get out into your streets. You got to be visiting these buildings, seeing when they're going up, once they're up, taking advantage of every opportunity you get to actually be a student of what's in your district and what the challenges are going to be.
No, absolutely. You could have said it any better. I think, again, to close out our episode here and close out our series, the lessons and the learnings are resonating out of the NIOSH reports, out of after action reports, those reports that might be departmentally based and have never gone beyond the confines of your organization. But certainly the lessons and learnings and recommendations are rooted in the sacrifices paid by numerous firefighters, especially coming out of the NIOSH reports and the recommendations, many of which we've mentioned here, and many more that, again, we have not, and not by deliberate action. It's just a matter that there are many other reports that highlight, again, commercial fireground incidences and various lessons and learnings that are drawn out of those to hopefully, again, try to limit or eliminate potential occurrences in the future. So do not underestimate the potential risk associated with these structures, and really fall back upon knowledge, skills, develop the appropriateness in all related areas for that next operation that you go out there. The challenge is not going to go away. I think it's certainly going to continue to increase, and we will have other conversations here, either on a very specific topic on fire and training on Doug's program, or certainly here on Buildings on Fire. So again, until next time, companies are in quarters off the air. Stay safe. Keep in mind that there's a job being worked somewhere in the streets, in your city, across the country, and around the world, doing what we do best, and that's being firefighters. So again, take care, everyone. Thank you very much for listening in on our series here on Fire and Training with Chief Doug Cline, and Buildings on Fire here with your host, Chris Naum. So until next time, we're signing off. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time around.
Breathing in diesel exhaust fumes is like walking into a fire without a mask. Over time, those toxins lead to cancer. Protect yourself with MagneGrip, the easiest, most reliable exhaust removal system that features a true 100% seal to eliminate diesel exhaust fumes. To get free grant assistance, visit MagneGrip.com.